The ballroom at Holcombe Hall glowed with too much candlelight, and Vivian Marsh stood at the edge of it like a moth that had forgotten how to fly. The chandeliers above her dripped soft yellow flame, and the wax made the air smell sweet and a little heavy, like a cake that had been left too long in a warm oven. Silk dresses brushed against silk dresses, and the sound was the small, dry whisper of paper being turned in a quiet room. Somewhere across the floor, a violin played a tune she had heard at 3 balls already that season. She knew the part where the bow always lifted. She knew the part where the dancers always turned. She knew it the way she knew the seams of her own gloves. She adjusted her gloves now. That was her routine. She did it slowly, smoothing the cream-colored kid leather over each finger one at a time, tugging the small pearl button at her wrist until it sat exactly right. It was a small task that meant nothing. That was why she loved it. When her hands were busy, no one expected her to speak. When no one expected her to speak, no one noticed she was not speaking. And when no one noticed her, she could breathe. Vivian was not ugly. She had been told this in a careful voice by her aunt, who meant it as comfort and delivered it like a verdict. She was not ugly. She was simply, somehow, not seen. Her hair was the color of wet straw. Her eyes were a quiet gray. Her dress this evening was the pale green of a leaf that had not yet finished growing. She had stood in front of the mirror that afternoon and decided, with the cool honesty she used only on herself, that she looked like a wall. A wall, she thought, was not a bad thing to be. Walls held up roofs. Walls kept the cold out. Walls did not need to dance. The orchestra slid into a new piece, and she counted ceiling tiles. There were 64 squares of plaster painted with small gold leaves in the middle of each one. She had counted them the first time she came to Holcombe Hall, when she was 17, and again at 20, and again now at 23. The number had never changed. She found this comforting. Things should stay the same. People asked too much when things changed. Near the long windows, her cousin Petra was laughing very loudly at something a thin young man had said. Petra always laughed loudly. Her mother, Vivian's Aunt Marjorie, had told her once that a woman's laugh was her second face. Petra had taken this to mean she should laugh more. Vivian had taken it to mean she should not laugh at all. The two of them had grown up in the same house and come out as opposite shapes. A footman passed with a tray of small glasses. The wine in them was the color of bruised plums. Vivian did not take one. She had learned that wine made her cheeks pink and her tongue too quick. And when her tongue was too quick, she said true things. And true things were a kind of trouble nobody at a ball had time for. The double doors at the far end of the hall opened. They opened the way they always did, with a small, dull groan from the iron hinges. But the room changed. It was not a loud change, nothing as honest as a gasp. It was more like the moment in a stable when one horse lifts its head and then all the others lift theirs, without knowing why. The candle flames did not flicker, the music did not stop, but every back in the room straightened by a finger's width. A man had walked in. He did not look around. He did not need to. He gave his hat and his gloves to a servant without seeming to notice the servant, and the servant did not seem to notice him either, which meant they had done this many times. The Duke of Ravenmere was not handsome the way the young men by the punch bowl were handsome. He had a heavy jaw and a heavier look in his eyes, and a coat the color of deep river water that had been cut to fit him and not the fashion. He was tall, but not so tall that he had to stoop. He moved without hurry. He took up the room the way a fireplace takes up a room, without effort, just by being warm and dark and central. A small flock of mothers turned toward him at once, the way iron filings turn toward a magnet. Their daughters were already arranged, like small pretty cakes, in the spots the mothers had chosen earlier in the week. Vivian had watched the arranging. She had been impressed by the planning of it. It was, she thought, the kind of war that did not get written into books. The Duke ignored them. He did this politely. He inclined his head to one dowager, said 3 words to another, and did not stop walking. He looked across the room, not at any face in particular, with the air of a man counting his own thoughts. His gaze drifted slowly. It passed the orchestra. It passed the line of dancers. It passed Petra and her thin young man. It stopped on Vivian. She did not know it stopped. She was tugging her left glove again, because the seam had begun to twist along her smallest finger. She frowned a little, because she hated when the seam twisted. She bent her head and gave the glove one more careful pull. When she looked up again, the Duke of Ravenmere was still watching her. He had been watching, she realized, for too long. She did not look away. She did not know why she did not look away. Looking down was the safe thing. Looking down was what walls did. But his eyes had a heaviness in them, a steady kind of weight, and to look away felt suddenly rude, like turning your back on a person who had spoken to you in the street. So she met his look. Her own gaze was cool and a little tired. She was not trying to charm him. She was simply waiting for him to stop. He did not stop. Instead, he began to walk, across the floor, toward her. The mothers and the daughters and the carefully placed pretty cakes shifted to intercept him, but he walked through them the way a tall man walks through tall grass, without seeing it. Vivian watched him come and felt a small, cold knot tighten in her stomach. She knew this trick. She had seen it played on other women. A great man pretends to choose the wallflower for a single dance as a joke between him and his friends. Later, the joke is told over brandy. Later, the wallflower hears about it from a maid. She set her jaw. If this was the trick, she would be a polite wall, and then she would go home. He stopped in front of her. He did not bow deeply. He inclined his head, the same small motion he had given the dowagers, and he said, in a low voice, "Miss Marsh." He said her name as though he had said it before, as though he had practiced it, as though it were a word he already knew the shape of. Vivian curtsied. Her curtsy was correct. She had practiced it once and never bothered to practice it again. "Your Grace." "You are not dancing," he said. "No," she said. A small silence. She did not fill it. She was very good at not filling silences. People often filled them for her. He did not fill it either. He looked down at her. He was a tall man and she was a small woman, and the difference made the look heavier, and he waited. "I do not dance well," she said at last. She had not meant to say it. It came out because she did not feel like lying, and because there was something in the quiet of him that made performing seem like a great deal of work for very little reward. "I am told I dance worse," he said. She blinked. She had expected many things. She had not expected this. "Are you fishing for sympathy, Your Grace?" she said. His mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the small shift a mouth makes when a smile has been considered and refused. "No," he said. "I am stating a fact. I asked for the truth. I gave you mine in return." "That seems an unfair trade. You asked me about dancing. I did not ask you about anything." "You may," he said, "if you wish." She studied him. He was waiting. He was a man, she realized, who could wait for a very long time without showing it. The mothers and the daughters were watching them now. She could feel the watching the way you feel a draft from an open door. "Why did you cross the room to speak to me?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. She was proud of that. "Because I had been watching you for a quarter of an hour," he said, "and you had not looked at me once." "Is that a reason?" "It is the reason I have." The candle nearest them sputtered and threw a slow drop of wax onto the silver tray below it. The smell of the burning wick reached her, a small, sharp animal smell, like a wet match. The orchestra started a new piece. Couples moved into a new pattern on the floor. The dupe did not invite her to dance. She found, after a moment, that she was glad. "You will excuse me," she said. "I think my aunt is looking for me." Her aunt was not looking for her. Her aunt never looked for her. But it was a polite thing to say, and it ended the conversation, which was what she wanted. He inclined his head. "Miss Marsh?" She walked away. She did not run, because walls did not run, but she walked at a steady pace that did not invite anyone to stop her. She found a chair near the window and she sat in it. The cold from the glass touched her bare shoulder, and she was grateful for it. Her cheeks, she suspected, were not as pale as she would have liked. Across the room, the Duke of Ravenmere was speaking to her uncle. Her uncle was nodding the way men nod when they are being told something they do not want to misunderstand. Petra was watching too. Petra's eyes had gone very still, in the way they did just before she said something pretty and cruel. Vivian adjusted her gloves and counted ceiling tiles. There were still 64. The world had not changed. Only the rooms inside her had. 2 weeks passed, and in 2 weeks she saw him 3 more times. The first time was at the lending library on Bracken Street. She had gone there to return a book of essays and to pick up a small volume of poems she had ordered, though she did not particularly want the poems. She wanted, mostly, an excuse to walk for half an hour without anyone asking her opinion of anything. The library smelled of old paper and damp wool, and a faint trace of the cinnamon that Mr. Halpin, the librarian, kept in a small dish behind his counter because he believed it kept moths away. The cinnamon did not keep moths away. The moths were doing very well, but Vivian loved the smell of it, and she loved Mr. Halpin, who had known her since she was 10 and never asked her to be charming. She had her poems in her hand and was turning to leave when she saw the Duke of Ravenmere at the far end of the reading room. He was not reading. He was standing by the window with a small book open in his palm, and he was looking at her. She nearly walked out without speaking. Instead, because Mr. Halpin was watching, and because it would have been rude in front of Mr. Halpin, she crossed to him. "Your Grace?" "Miss Marsh." "You read poetry?" "Sometimes." "What sort?" He turned the book so she could see the spine. It was a small, worn book of country songs, the kind that farm wives sang to children at the washtub. She had expected something serious and Greek. She had not expected this. "My mother used to sing one of these," he said, "when I was small. I cannot remember the words. I came in to find them." "Have you found them?" "No." She looked at the book. She looked at him. He did not look like a man who had ever been small, but she supposed every man had once been small, and every small boy had once had a mother who sang. "Which one?" she asked. He read the first line of a song to her, quietly, so Mr. Halpin would not hear. She knew it at once. Her own nurse had sung it. She gave him the next line. He looked at her then with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like a man who had been told a road was washed out and found it open after all. "Thank you," he said. "It is only a song, Your Grace." "It is the song," he said. "Thank you, Miss Marsh." She left the library with her poems and a strange warmth behind her breastbone, like a coal that had been put there without her noticing. The second time was at a dinner her aunt could not refuse. He sat 4 seats away from her. He did not speak to her once, but twice during the meal she looked up and found his eyes on her, and twice she looked back at him steadily and did not look away first. The third time was in the lane behind her uncle's house, which was not a place a Duke of Ravenmere had any business being. He was on horseback. His horse was a tall black mare with a long, quiet face. He had drawn the mare up by the low stone wall, and he was simply waiting, in the way she had begun to recognize. "Are you lost, Your Grace?" she said. "I am not." "Then what are you doing in my uncle's lane?" "Sitting on my horse." "That is not an answer." "It is the answer I have," he said. The black mare blew out a soft breath and tossed her head, and the smell of horse, warm hide, leather, sweet hay, rose up between them in the cold autumn air. Vivian could feel the warmth coming off the animal's flank from 3 feet away. "You are an odd man," she said. "I have been told." "By whom?" "By everyone who has ever known me long enough to be honest." She almost laughed. She did not laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved, and he saw it, and his own mouth did the same small, considering thing it had done in the ballroom, as though a smile had been weighed and put back on the shelf. "Good day, Miss Marsh." "Good day, Your Grace." He rode away. She stood at the wall for a long time before she went inside, and when she went inside she did not tell her aunt she had spoken to a duke in the lane, because some things were not for telling. It was Petra who tried to ruin her in the end. Vivian had always known it would be Petra. Cousins know these things the way trees know the wind. The night was a card party at the home of Lady Aldrich, who had a large drawing room and very strong opinions about everyone in it. There were perhaps 30 people there, small enough to be intimate, large enough that a humiliation could not be hidden. The room was warm. The fire was banked too high. The smell of beeswax candles and orange peel from the punch hung thick in the air. Vivian had been losing politely at whist for half an hour and was glad of it, because losing at whist required nothing of her but to sit still and look slightly disappointed. Petra came over with 2 glasses of negus. She set one down by Vivian's elbow. She did not sit. She stood instead in a way that made the people at the next table look up. Petra was very good at standing in ways that made people look up. "Vivian, darling," she said, in the voice she used when she meant to draw blood, "I think you must let me speak to you honestly. You are family. Someone must." Vivian set down her cards. She did this slowly. She did this carefully. She felt the room begin to lean, the way a room leans when something is about to happen and everyone wants a better view. "Yes, Petra. It is about the Duke." The word landed in the room like a coin dropped on glass. The Duke himself was there. He was standing by the fireplace with his back half turned, talking to Lord Aldrich about a horse. He did not turn his head, but his shoulders shifted by a very small degree, and Vivian saw it, and she understood that he was listening. "What about him, Petra?" she said. "He has paid you small attentions." Petra's voice was sweet. It was very sweet. The sweetness was a knife wrapped in a ribbon. "And I think it is unkind not to tell you the truth, since no one else seems willing. Men like the Duke do not look at women like you because they admire them, Vivian. They look at women like you because they are tired. They look at us when they want a wife. They look at you the way a tired man looks at a plain glass of water. It is restful, dear. It is not love. And I would rather you heard it from me, who loves you, than from the world, which does not." The room went silent. It did not go silent the way a room goes silent in a story. It went silent the way a real room goes silent, in layers. First, the laughter at the next table stopped. Then the small clink of a spoon against a punch glass stopped. Then the soft hum of 3 or 4 conversations slowed and broke off, one by one, like candles being snuffed. Lady Aldrich by the door made a tiny sound in her throat and did not finish it. Someone, Vivian could not see who, set down a cup very carefully on a wooden table, and the small wooden click of it was, in that hush, the loudest thing in the world. By the fire, the Duke of Ravenmere had turned. He was not looking at Petra. He was looking at Vivian. Vivian did not cry. She had known somewhere underneath her ribs that this was coming, and she had decided long ago what she would do if it did. She had decided in front of her mirror at 16 that she would not give her cousin tears. Tears were a kind of payment. She would not pay. She picked up the glass of negus Petra had set by her elbow. The drink was warm. The smell of cloves and lemon rose up out of it, sharp and almost medicinal. She held the glass for 1 slow second. Then she set it down again, untouched, on Petra's side of the table. "Then you should drink it, Petra," she said. Her voice was very quiet. It was not loud enough to carry. It did not need to be. "Since you brought it for me out of love." She stood. She did not push back her chair quickly. She lifted it the way one lifts a chair when one does not want to scrape the floor. She set it back gently against the table. She nodded to her hostess, who had gone the color of clean linen. She nodded to the 2 ladies across the whist table, who were staring at her as though she had grown wings. Then she walked out of the drawing room. Her back was straight. Her hands did not shake. She did not look at the Duke. She did not look at Petra. She did not look back at all. In the hall, the footman with the cloaks blinked at her. She gave him her ticket. Her gloved hand did not tremble. He gave her the cloak. She put it on. She walked out into the night, and the cold air was a sharp, clean slap on her hot face. And only then, only on the front step of Lady Aldrich's house with no one to see, did she close her eyes for 1 breath. 1. Just 1. Then she opened them again, and she walked down the steps to find her uncle's carriage.
Inside Lady Aldrith's drawing room, the silence held for what felt like a long time, but was probably only the time it took for a clock on the mantel to tick 3 times. Then Lady Aldrith said, in a voice slightly too bright, "Petra, dear, would you help me with the punch?" And Petra, who had not moved, finally moved, and the room slowly remembered how to breathe. The Duke of Ravenmere did not finish his conversation about the horse. He did not, in fact, say anything at all. He waited a polite quarter hour. He took his leave. He thanked his hostess. He did not look at Petra Marsh. He went home. He went into his study. He shut the door. He sat for a long time in the chair behind his desk without lighting more than 1 candle. The candle flame trembled in a small draught from the window. The fire in the grate had burned down to red coals that pulsed softly, like a heart that was thinking. The smell of wood smoke and old leather books filled the room. He did not read. He did not write. He put his palms flat on the desk, and he thought. He was a man who solved problems. He had always been a man who solved problems. His father had been a man of feeling, and feeling had not served his father well. Feeling had cost the estate 2 bad investments and 1 foolish duel, and a wife who had died of a fever the year the roof needed mending. The Duke had learned young that what worked was not feeling, but the cool, steady habit of looking at a thing and asking what it required. A roof required slate. A debt required payment. A horse required exercise. A son required discipline. A tenant required fairness. The world was a list of things, and each thing wanted what it wanted, and the trick was to give it that thing without sentiment. He had been looking at Vivian Marsh off and on for 2 weeks. He had identified, in his quiet, practical way, several facts about her. She did not lie. She did not flatter. She did not perform. She knew the words to a country song his mother had once sung. She had a small private habit of straightening her gloves when she was nervous, and she was nervous more often than anyone in the rooms she stood in knew. She had the kind of mind that counted ceiling tiles when bored, which meant she had a mind. She was not pretty in a way that frightened men, which he supposed should not have mattered to him, but he was honest enough to know it did. He had been frightened by pretty women before. He had married one of the pretty ones, briefly, when he was 22. She had died in childbed before either of them had finished learning what they were doing to each other. He did not speak of her. He did not speak of the child either, who had died with her. He thought of them rarely, and when he did, the thought arrived as a small, dull pressure under his sternum, like a button pressed too hard against the skin. He had not intended to think about marrying again. He had thought of mistresses briefly, and rejected the idea because mistresses were a kind of staff, and he had quite enough staff. He had thought more often of simply being alone for the rest of his life, and the thought had not displeased him. And then he had walked into the ballroom at Holcombe Hall and seen a small woman in a pale green dress tugging at her glove. He thought about that now. He thought about it without pretending it had been a romantic moment. It had not been a romantic moment. It had been an identification. He had looked across that room of pretty cakes and seen one woman who was not for sale. He had crossed the room to confirm it. He had confirmed it. Tonight he had identified another fact. Vivian Marsh's family did not deserve her. Her cousin had attempted, in his presence, in the presence of 30 witnesses, to convince a roomful of the county's gossips that she was a tired man's restful glass of water, and Vivian Marsh had answered with a sentence so quiet that only the people at her table had heard it, and then she had walked out of the room without giving any of them what they wanted. She had dignity. He had not, until this evening, fully understood how rare dignity was. He had a problem. The problem was this. Vivian Marsh was going to spend the rest of her life in rooms where people like her cousin were allowed to speak. He could see it, the way he could see the slate that needed replacing on the east wing of his estate. She would grow older. She would grow quieter. She would tug at her gloves in more and more rooms, and one day she would stop noticing she was doing it, and one day after that she would stop tugging at all, and a woman who had stopped tugging at her gloves was a woman who had finished hoping. He did not want that. He sat with this. He did not let himself call it love. He was not certain it was love. He had been certain about love once before, and that certainty had cost him too much. He preferred, now, the language of problems and solutions. What he could say with certainty was this: he had identified a woman who interested him, and he did not wish to live in a world in which she was made to stop being herself in order to survive. That was within his power to change. He rose from the desk. He took out a sheet of cream-colored paper. He wrote, in his blunt black hand, a short letter to a friend at the College of Heralds about a question of procedure. He wrote a second letter to his solicitor. He wrote a third letter, very short, to Vivian Marsh's uncle, requesting the favor of a private interview at the gentleman's earliest convenience. He sealed all three. He set them on the silver tray for the morning post. Then he sat in his chair again and looked at the dying fire for a long time. And he did not call what he was feeling by any name at all. Vivian did not leave her room for 2 days. She did not weep. She read the small book of poems she had bought at Mr. Halpin's library. She wrote 3 letters and burned all of them. She ate her dinner from a tray her maid brought up, and her maid, who loved her, did not tell her what the servants downstairs were saying, which was a great deal. On the 3rd day, her uncle knocked on her door himself, which he had not done since she was 12 and had fallen off a pony. He came into her sitting room with the look of a man who has been handed a parcel and is not entirely sure which way is up. "Vivian," he said. "Uncle, the Duke of Ravenmere has called on me." She set down her book. She did not show anything in her face. She had grown skilled this week at not showing anything in her face. "Has he?" "He has." Her uncle sat down in the small chair by the window, which creaked under him because he was a large man and the chair was a small one. "He has made me an offer." "For what?" Her uncle looked at her. "Oh," she said. The word came out flat. It did not sound like a question. It did not sound like a yes. It sounded, more than anything, like the small noise a person makes when she steps into water and finds it colder than she had been told. "He wishes to call on you," her uncle said, "formally. He has asked my permission. I have given it. He wishes to know if you will receive him this afternoon." "Did he say why?" Her uncle hesitated. "He said," her uncle began, and then stopped, and then began again. "He said it was a matter he would prefer to discuss with you directly, and that he understood if you refused." She thought about this. She thought about Petra. She thought about 30 witnesses in Lady Aldrith's drawing room. She thought about a tired man and a plain glass of water. "I will receive him," she said. He came at 4. The light through the drawing room windows was the soft yellow light of an autumn afternoon, the kind of light that makes even worn carpet look almost new. The fire had been lit. The smell of beeswax and the faint, dry smell of last year's roses in the porcelain bowl on the mantel mingled in the warm air. Her aunt sat in the corner with her embroidery, because it was not proper for them to be alone, and her aunt's needle made a small, steady sound against the linen, in and out, like a small clock that had agreed not to chime. The Duke of Ravenmere came in. He bowed. She rose and curtsied. They sat. Her aunt's needle went on. "Miss Marsh." "Your Grace." He did not speak for a moment. He looked at her. He looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and her gloves, which were the same cream-colored kid as at the ball, and the small pearl button at her wrist, which she had not touched once since he came in. He looked at her face, which was pale, and at the small shadow under her left eye, which had not been there 2 weeks ago. "I have come," he said, "to ask you to marry me." Her aunt's needle stopped. It stopped in the cloth, halfway through a stitch. Vivian did not look at her aunt. She looked at the Duke. "Why?" she said. It was the same question she had asked in the ballroom. She did not soften it. She did not pretty it. She wanted to know. He sat with the question for a moment. Then he answered it. "Because," he said, "I went home from Lady Aldrith's the other night and sat in my study for a long time, and I understood that I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms where people speak the way your cousin spoke. And I understood that I will go on spending my life in such rooms whether I like it or not, and I would rather not spend it in those rooms alone, and I would rather not spend it beside any woman in those rooms. But you." He paused. He looked at his hands. Then he looked back at her. "I am not a man of feeling, Miss Marsh. I have been told this. I will not pretend to be one. I will not promise you what I do not know I can give. I can promise you this. I have watched you for 2 weeks. I have not seen you lie. I have not seen you perform. I have seen you, in a drawing room with 30 people in it, refuse to drink what your cousin handed you and walk out without raising your voice. I have not seen a thing like that in my life, and I have been to many drawing rooms." He stopped. The fire in the grate gave a small, soft pop. Somewhere outside, in the lane, a dog barked twice and then was quiet. Her aunt did not move. "I do not ask for an answer today," he said. "I ask only that you consider it. I will call again on Friday if you permit it. If your answer then is no, I will not ask again." Vivian sat very still. She did not look at her aunt. She did not look at the fire. She looked at him. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Marsh, you did not say one thing." He waited. "You did not say you loved me." His face did not change, but something in his eyes did. Something small, the way the surface of a deep well changes when a stone is dropped into it, and the ripples have not yet reached the rim. "No," he said, "I did not." "Why not?" "Because I do not know yet whether what I feel is love," he said, "or whether it is the relief of having found one honest person in a county full of liars. And I will not lie to you, Miss Marsh, not even to win you, especially not to win you." She held his look for a long moment. The clock on the mantel ticked. Her aunt's needle, somewhere in the corner of the room, began again, very quietly. "Friday," she said. He rose. He bowed. He left. She did not go to her room. She walked instead into the small back garden where the late roses were dying in their slow brown way, and she stood among them for a long time, and she did not tug at her gloves once. She said yes on Friday. She said it quietly, with the same flat, clean voice she had said most things in her life, and he received it the same way. There was no kiss. There was no kneeling. There was a small inclining of his head and a steady look, and the word, "Thank you," said as if he meant it like a man means the word bread when he has been hungry. The engagement was announced. The county lost its mind. Aunt Marjorie wept and would not be comforted, though it was not clear whether she was weeping with joy or with the recognition that she had badly misjudged the market. Petra did not weep. Petra grew very pale and very quiet, and she did not come to the small dinner the family held the next week, and Vivienne did not ask after her. The wedding was small. The breakfast after was smaller. By dusk that day, Vivienne Marsh was Vivienne, Duchess of Ravenmere, and she was sitting in a carriage beside a man she barely knew, riding north toward a house she had never seen, with the smell of the new leather seats and the cold autumn rain on her face through the half-open window, and she thought, with a kind of calm wonder, that her life had changed, and her hands were not shaking. She did not know yet that her life was about to change again. It happened in late November, when they had been married 6 weeks. The house at Ravenmere was vast and cold in the way old stone houses are cold, and warm in the way old stone houses are warm. That is to say, the great draughty halls held the chill of every winter that had passed through them, but every room with a fire in it felt like the inside of a hand cupped around a candle. She had begun to learn its rooms. She had begun very slowly to learn its master. He worked too much. He did not sleep enough. He spoke to her at breakfast about the estate, about a dispute between 2 tenants, about the price of barley, about a letter from his cousin in Devon, and she answered him with the same plain, steady voice she had used at her uncle's table. And he listened to her answers as though they were the answers of a man he respected. He did not touch her. He had not touched her. She slept in her own room. He slept in his. She did not ask why, and he did not say why, and the not asking and the not saying were, in their own quiet way, a kind of pact between them. We will be patient. We will not pretend. We will not perform. In the 6th week, The steward came to her at breakfast with a small, distressed look and asked, in a low voice, if Her Grace would mind very much speaking to a cook's helper named Annie, who had got herself into trouble of a particular sort and was to be sent away that morning. Vivienne knew what trouble of a particular sort meant. She set down her cup. She said she would speak to Annie. The Duke, across the table, looked up from his letter and did not say anything, but the small line between his brows deepened. Vivienne went down to the kitchen. Annie was 18. She was small and pink-faced and crying in the loud, frank way young women cry when they have nothing left to lose. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cobb, stood at the door with her arms folded. Vivienne sat down at the long scrubbed pine table across from the girl. The kitchen smelled of bread and onions and something burning slightly at the back of the great hearth. The stone floor was cold even through her shoes. Annie's hands, gripping each other on the table, were red and chapped. "Annie," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Where will you go?" "My aunt's, Your Grace, in Leeds, if she would take me. I do not know if she will." "Do you have the fare?" The girl began to cry harder. Vivienne understood then that the girl did not have the fare, and that "sent away" in this house, like in most houses, meant put on the road with a small bundle and a character that was no character at all. "Mrs. Cobb," Vivienne said, "Your Grace, Annie will not be sent away today. She will stay in the kitchen until I have spoken to His Grace. If His Grace insists that she will go with a month's wages and her fare to Leeds and a letter from me to her aunt. Is that understood?" Mrs. Cobb's mouth did several small things and settled finally on a tight, "Yes, Your Grace." Vivienne went up the back stairs to her husband's study. She knocked. She went in. She told him in plain words what she had said in the kitchen. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She may stay, quietly, until she is fit to travel. Then she will go to Leeds with her wages and her fare, as you have said." "Thank you, Vivienne." It was the first time he had said her name without the Miss or the Your Grace or the small formality that had hung between them like a curtain. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. He was sitting behind his desk. The fire was low. The smell of wood smoke and ink was in the room. The line between his brows was still there, but it had softened, very slightly. "For what?" she said. "For going down to the kitchen yourself." She did not know what to say to that. She nodded. She went out. She closed the door very softly behind her. 3 weeks later, she learned the thing she was not supposed to learn. She was in the small parlour with Mrs. Cobb, going over the linen accounts, when one of the village women came to the back door asking for the housekeeper. Vivienne, who had been about to leave anyway, said she would walk Mrs. Cobb to the door. The village woman was a midwife. The midwife wanted to thank Mrs. Cobb for the basket. Vivienne, polite and uninvolved, asked which basket. The midwife, who had not been told to be quiet because no one had thought it necessary, said the basket His Grace had sent the week before for old Mrs. Hatton, who had been sick since harvest, and the medicine, and the man to mend her roof, which had been leaking since her husband died 3 winters back. His Grace had sent the man himself, the midwife said, with strict instructions that no one was to mention his name. Mrs. Hatton, the midwife added, had wept like a child when the roofer came, and she had said 3 Hail Marys for the Duke, even though she was Methodist and was not supposed to. Mrs. Cobb, behind the midwife, made small, frantic eyes at Vivienne over the woman's shoulder. Vivienne smiled. "Please give Mrs. Hatton my regards," she said, "and tell her I am glad her roof is mended." She walked back into the small parlour. She closed the door. She sat down in the chair by the window. The fire crackled. The smell of the dried lavender in the bowl on the small table reached her, faint and warm. She put her palms flat on her knees and she sat for a long time. She did not say anything to him about it that night at dinner. She did not say anything to him about it the next morning. She thought about it instead. She thought about a man who could ride into a village and order a roof mended on a widow's cottage, and then ride home and say nothing. Not at breakfast, and not at supper. and never mention it to the wife he had married for reasons he had explained, on the day he asked her, as being unable to spend his life in certain rooms beside any woman but her. A man like that, she thought, was not a man who did not feel. A man like that was a man who felt so much that he had decided long ago not to be caught at it. She thought about that for a long time, and then, very slowly, she began to set out in her own mind the small ways she would not let him be lonely in his feeling anymore. She did not tell him she knew. She did not need to. Instead, the next morning when the post came, she found among her letters one addressed in her own writing, to herself, that was, in fact, a small note for him. She left it on the corner of his desk after he had gone out to the stables. The note said only this: "I went down to the kitchen because once, when I was 16, the cook at my uncle's house was sent away in disgrace, and I did nothing, and I have been ashamed of it ever since. Thank you for letting Annie stay. V." When he came home that evening, the note was gone from his desk. It was not on the desk. It was not in the fire. She did not ask. He did not say. But at dinner that night, he set down his glass, and he looked at her across the candles. There were 6 candles in the silver branches between them, and they smelled faintly of beeswax and the cold winter rosemary the housekeeper had begun tucking into the boughs. And he said, "Vivian?" "Yes." "I went into Halford today. There is a woman there, a widow, Hatton. Her roof—" "I know about the roof," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. He did not look surprised exactly. He looked, more than anything, the way a man looks when a thing he has been carrying alone is suddenly being held, very steadily, on the other side as well. "How?" he said. "The midwife came to thank Mrs. Cobb. I happened to be there. She said you had told no one to speak of it." "I had." She did not know. No. A silence. The candles guttered very slightly. Outside the long windows of the dining room, the first thin snow of the winter had begun to fall, and the flakes pressed white and slow against the dark glass. "Why?" she said, and her voice was very soft. "Did you not want me to know?" He looked at his plate. He looked up again. "Because," he said, "I have made the choice all my life to do these things quietly. And if I do them and then tell people, they stop being the thing they were. They become a different thing. They become a coin I have spent. And you did not want to spend the coin with me." "I did not want," he said, "to make you think I was buying you with it." She put down her fork. She rose from her chair. She walked the length of the long dining table. It was a great oak table that could seat 30 people, and at which they had eaten every night, the 2 of them, at opposite ends, like 2 small candles at opposite ends of a long room. And she stopped beside his chair. He looked up at her. He did not stand. She put her hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him since their wedding day, when she had taken his arm to walk down the aisle. She felt, under her palm, through the dark wool of his coat, the heat of him, and the small, steady working of his shoulder as he breathed. He did not move. He looked up at her, and his eyes were very still. "You are not buying me, Crispin," she said. It was the first time she had said his name. "You have already bought nothing. I am here because I chose to be here. Whatever you do quietly in the world is yours. But I would like, if you will let me, to know about some of it. Not to make a coin of it, only because I would like to know the man I married." He did not speak for a long moment. The fire on the hearth gave a soft tick. Somewhere upstairs, very faintly, one of the maids was singing in a low, absent voice as she made up a bed. He reached up, and he put his hand over her hand, where it rested on his shoulder, and he held it there. "Sit," he said. "Sit, and I will tell you about Mrs. Hatton's roof." She sat. She did not go back to her own end of the table. She sat in the chair at his right hand, where the housekeeper had laid no place, and a footman moved the cutlery without being asked. Crispin, Duke of Ravenmere, told his wife about a roof. And then, because she asked, he told her about the man at the lodge whose wife had died, and who had not opened the gates himself for 2 months, and how he had been quietly sending another man down to do it. And then, because she asked again, He told her about a small farm he had bought back from a creditor and given to the family that had lost it. He told her these things in his blunt black voice with no softness in it, and she listened with the same blunt, steady attention she had given him at her uncle's drawing room, and somewhere between the second story and the third, she understood that the man she had married had been waiting, for many years, for one person on earth to ask him these things and not be afraid of the answers. Petra Marsh tried one last time in February. She came to call. She came with her mother. She had on a new bonnet and her face had thinned over the winter, and her eyes had a hungry edge that Vivian, who knew her cousin's eyes very well, recognized at once. They sat in the green drawing room. The fire had been built up to keep out the cold, and the smell of applewood smoke filled the air, sweeter than oak. Vivian poured tea with her own hand because she liked the small task of it. Her aunt and her cousin made small, careful conversation. They admired the new wallpaper, which was 3 years old. They admired the carpet, which had been there since the last Duchess. Petra admired Vivian's dress, which was nothing remarkable. Then, in a small lull, Petra said, "Cousin, I have wished to say to you for some months what I said that night at Lady Aldrith's. I was unkind. I was not myself." Vivian set down her cup. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at Petra. Petra's hands on her lap were not quite steady. "You were yourself, Petra," Vivian said quietly. "I think you were exactly yourself. You said what you believed. I do not hold it against you. We cannot help what we believe." "Vivian, you are welcome in my house, Petra," Vivian went on in the same quiet voice. "You will always be welcome. You are my cousin. But we will not, you and I, pretend you did not say what you said. I do not need you to be sorry. I do not need you to take it back. I only need you to understand that I heard it, and that I have not forgotten." Petra opened her mouth. She closed it. Across the room her mother had gone very pink. The door of the drawing room opened. Crispin came in. He had come from the stables, and he smelled, faintly, of horse and cold air. He bowed to Aunt Marjorie and to Petra. He sat down beside Vivian, not opposite her, beside her, and he took, with his own hand, the cup of tea his wife poured for him without his asking. He did not say anything sharp to Petra. He did not say anything to Petra at all. He spoke instead to Aunt Marjorie, very politely, about her journey, and about her health, and about whether the roads from the village had been kept clear in the snow. Petra sat very small in her chair, and Vivian, watching her, understood that her cousin had come today for some kind of forgiveness that would let her go home and tell her friends she was a guest at Ravenmere. And Vivian understood also that she would not give it to her, and that she did not need to be cruel to withhold it. She had only to be exactly herself. When her aunt and her cousin left, an hour later, Petra paused in the hall with her bonnet ribbons in her hand. She looked at Vivian. Her face was very tired. "You have grown into yourself, cousin," she said. It was perhaps the truest thing Petra had ever said to her. "Yes," Vivian said, "I have." She watched the carriage roll away down the long drive. The snow on the gravel had melted to dark patches. The smell of the cold, wet stone of the front step rose around her ankles. Behind her, Crispin came into the hall, and he stood beside her in the open doorway and did not put his hand on her. They were still careful, still patient, but he stood close enough that the wool of his coat brushed the wool of her shawl, and she felt the small warmth of him along her arm. "Vivian," he said. "Yes, I would like sometime soon to learn to dance, properly, with you." She turned her head. She looked at him. The corner of his mouth was doing the small, considering thing again. She thought, looking at him, that she might have spent her whole life with a man and never seen his face become as clear to her as it was, suddenly, now, in the cold, pale light of a February afternoon. "I do not dance well, Your Grace," she said. "I am told I dance worse," he said. She laughed. It was not loud. It was not Petra's laugh. It was a small, soft sound, almost surprised at itself. The laugh of a woman who had forgotten she could. He looked at her when she laughed. He looked at her for a long time. And then, very slowly, in the open doorway of his great cold stone house, with the smell of snow and applewood smoke around them, he lifted her gloved hand. She was wearing her gloves, the same cream-colored kid she had worn at the ball where they had met, and he held it in his. He did not kiss it. He only held it. He held it long enough that she felt the heat of his palm come through the thin kid leather and warm her own cold fingers. He held it long enough that she understood, with a kind of clear, quiet wonder, that he had been wanting to hold her hand since the night she walked out of Lady Aldrith's drawing room. "Crispin," she said. "Yes. You may close the door now. It is cold." He laughed then, really laughed, a low, rough sound, as though he had not used the muscle in some years, and was surprised to find it still worked. And he closed the door. A year passed. The house at Ravenmere learned to be warm. It happened slowly, the way old stone learns warmth, fire by fire, room by room, winter by spring. The draughty hall by the library got new curtains, made by a widow in the village who had been glad of the work. The lodge gates were opened every morning by the man who had lost his wife, and one morning in late summer he opened them whistling, which he had not done for 2 years, and the under-gardener heard him and told the cook, and the cook told Mrs. Cobb, and Mrs. Cobb told the Duchess, and the Duchess only smiled and said, "Yes, I had hoped he might." Annie did not go to Leeds. Annie's child was born in March, a boy, and the Duchess stood as godmother at the village church, which was a thing the county talked about for some months, and then, having found nothing in it to complain of, stopped talking about. Annie went back to the kitchen and was given charge of the dairy, and her son grew up among the cheeses and the cold stone shelves and the smell of fresh cream, and his first word, the cook swore, was butter. Petra Marsh married a younger son of a baronet and went to live in Bath. She wrote sometimes polite, short letters. Vivian answered them politely and shortly. They had not become friends. They had become, instead, 2 women who had known each other as girls and now exchanged news of the weather. It was, on the whole, an improvement. The Duchess of Ravenmere learned to dance. She did not dance well. Her husband did not dance well either. They danced, in the long gallery, alone, in their stocking feet, on rainy afternoons, with the housekeeper pretending very hard, somewhere down the hall, not to hear the small, steady creak of the floor. On a soft evening in late October, almost exactly a year from the night at Lady Aldrith's, they sat in the small library together. The fire was low. The smell of the applewood smoke and the leather books and the cold autumn air through the slightly open window mingled in the warm room. He was reading a letter from his solicitor. She was reading a book of poems. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, somewhere in the dark, an owl spoke once, very softly, and was answered. She had been tugging at her glove. She did not, in the house, wear gloves indoors anymore, but she had come in from the garden, and she had forgotten. She felt the small, twisted seam at her smallest finger. She bent her head and pulled the pearl button at her wrist and set it right. She looked up. He was watching her. He had set down his letter. He was looking at her over the top of his reading glasses with his heavy, quiet gaze, the same gaze he had laid on her across a candlelit ballroom 1 year ago, when she had been a small woman in a pale green dress and a wall and a moth that had forgotten how to fly. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, but he did not look away. And she did not look away, and the fire crackled, and the owl spoke again, and the candle nearest them dropped a slow, soft tear of wax onto the silver dish below it. And Vivian, Duchess of Ravenmere, set down her book and walked across the small, bright room and took her husband's hand and held it. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.